Well, hello there. I want to welcome everybody. This is very exciting. Alisha Grogan has graciously agreed to come on and share her wisdom about picky eating. And picky eating is something that goes hand in hand with anxiety. And a lot of times, our anxious kids are also our picky eater kids. And that's not a coincidence. It's just because our kids are nervous about everything. They are nervous about what was that in the dark? What was that sound? What was that bump? What is this bump on my neck? What is this lump in my food? And so anxiety is rampant and it impacts so many different areas of our kids' lives, including picky eating. And I am a mom to 3 kids with various picky eating issues. And so I know that a lot of people in my audience also deal with picky eating. My 3 kids deal with picky eating for 3 completely different reasons. So my oldest, she has sensory processing issues. And so anything in her mouth, if it's too hot, too cold, too lumpy, too bumpy, too flavorful, it all upsets her. And my youngest is just your classic picky eater. What is that, mom? What's that dot in there? Is it going to taste gross? And my son has ARFID and he has intrusive thoughts around food. So I wanted to premise what we're talking about today about what it is and what it won't be. So today we're going to be talking about picky eating, the kind of picky eating that impacts our anxious kids when they're nervous about eating or they're very particular about eating. We're not going to be talking about OCD related to intrusive thoughts about their food or feeling like, kids with emetophobia who think that if they eat at all, they're going to throw up. We're not going to talk about those clinical issues. I talk about that a lot in my work. But today we're going to be talking about picky eating because a lot of us deal with that, just that general picky eating. So that was a big introduction. Welcome, Alisha Grogan. She's an occupational therapist and the creator of Your Kids Table, which is a fantastic website. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here with your community. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, you are my go-to person for picky eating. I've had you on the podcast. I'm pretty sure I've even done some Facebook Lives, maybe a Facebook Live with you once. I don't even know.
You've been on my page a couple times. Yeah,
that is true. I have not been Facebook Live friendly when it comes to bringing other people on until recently, because it was overwhelming enough by myself. To involve somebody else was like too hectic. But I'm getting so much better with my social anxiety.
Yeah,
I know. You got to face your fears. So
yes.
this class is being streamed, just so that you guys know, it's being streamed in multiple areas. So for those of you that are in my AT parenting community, which is a private community, I want you to know this is public, so that when you post a question, I want you to recognize that this is going out to more people than what we're normally used to. And it's being streamed on my profile. It's being streamed on my page, on my YouTube channel, and in my public group and in my community group. So just be aware of that. And Alisha is going to go through 3 of the most common ways that we can help our picky eaters like right away. And I love takeaway, easy solutions. So we're going to dive into that. And then we're also going to have some time, hopefully, for questions and answers too.
All right. Awesome. Yeah. So there's so much that we can talk about with picky eating, but for your audience, Natasha, I really wanted to focus on this kind of element of our kids that are feeling just anxious about the food that they're eating and just nervous and worried about it. Like you said, these 2 things go such hand in hand together. Even if the base root of like the problem is not anxiety, when kids have had negative experiences with food, they naturally put up this defense mechanism to be cautious about what they're going to eat or put in their mouth again, which really in and of itself is the definition of picky eating. I mean, they're not willing to eat those other things. I dare to say like 99.9% of all picky eaters have not tried these other foods. Like they have never even tried them, and they're deeming them unsafe because of how they look or how they're assuming they're going to feel, how they smell, those types of things. So with that in mind, that's where these 3 tips come from. So the very first tip that I have for your audience to help a child be more comfortable with food and to stop kind of these mealtime battles and the stress that all sort of comes with anytime food is down in front of them, is to tell them what they're eating in advance. It seems like a small thing, but it can make a huge difference for a picky eater. And if any of you think about, just kind of whether you have anxiety or not, most of us kind of like to know what's coming next. And we take that for granted in our kids' lives a lot. And eating is certainly not an exception. So when we can fill in the gap for them ahead of time and let them know that we're going to have a ham sandwich, which might not be their favorite thing at lunch, but there's also going to be some chips and some sliced apples, which they do eat, that can help decrease their anxiety. Whereas if we don't tell them and they just come to the table, they're going to look down, they're going to see that ham sandwich, and they're going to freak out. And their anxiety can also just start to build anticipating this. And I'm sure Natasha would speak to this, but sometimes like our youngest kids can't even verbalize that. So we can start to see some anxious behaviors coming out, even just preceding a meal, just because they're wondering what's going to be at the next meal. Or if you are trying to serve your child different foods, a lot of picky eaters are stuck kind of eating the same things over and over and over again. And a lot of parents tell me that I can't get new or different foods on their plate because they freak out when I do that. But when you tell them ahead of time, it makes a huge difference. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can menu plan, which is my favorite way and the way that I would prefer, but I know that can seem a little bit daunting, but you have to make time to plan that. So literally put it on your calendar like anything else. Now you can menu plan for the week. You can menu plan for the day. So it's something you could do early in the morning before your kids wake up. It could be something that you do after they go to bed. It could be something you do on the weekend and you just plan out the week ahead. If your children are old enough, post that on a whiteboard, put it on the refrigerator so they can see it, read it, and they don't have to keep coming to you. They will learn that, hey, this is what's coming, and make sure you always list the foods that they like to eat too. So if, again, you're serving something new, that they look on the list and they see, okay, we're having meatloaf, but we're also having French fries and we're having applesauce. Okay, like they can see all of that happening there. For younger kids, and to help reinforce this as you begin it, you definitely want to verbalize it. Like you want to tell them, hey, tomorrow for breakfast, we're going to be having waffles and bananas. And you can say that like at bedtime or, at some point in your routine, just very casually so that they know. Now, I'm not promising that there's still not going to be any tantrums as you move into this new kind of phase of just helping them learn what foods are coming. But it can make a really big difference in just decreasing their anxiety around that next meal, or when they get there, even if there's not even pre-anxiety, when they get there, it's like, oh, I don't want this. They sort of know what's coming, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I want to pause there and kind of explore tip number one. I think you bring up a couple of good points. One, I think it's really helpful to realize that there are some anticipatory anxiety behaviors that our kids will have. And a lot of times, in general, we don't recognize those cues as our kids being anxious. I often talk about kids kind of acting out right before bedtime. And I think a lot of times they act out before meals too, and we just don't make that connection, especially since we have 3 meals a day. They seem like maybe they're acting out all the time and we're not connecting those. And I love the idea of a whiteboard because, and I've heard you told me this before on the podcast. And I think it's such a good tip because I am pretty anal and I've been doing a whiteboard for my kids' work each day. We've been writing out, okay, you have to do like dream box and you have to do this and you have to do this. And to write in there what the meals are as well is not going to take too much of my time. And also it will help them visually see, because normally we just go to the go-to foods. I know my kids are going to have chicken nuggets for lunch. I know that my daughter's probably going to have a gluten-free waffle for breakfast. And for dinner, they'll say, Mom, what's for dinner? And I'll say, whatever it is. I won't add their go-to food, their safe food. and they just won't show up at the table. It's like, it's just my husband and I, we're not hungry, and I need to, get better at that. But if I had said we're going to have, whatever their go-to foods are, as well as the pork chops, I think maybe I get better attendance rates.
Yeah, right. And that's, you bring up a good point, because one of the advantages, there's a lot of advantages to menu planning. And I will fully admit, before the quarantine, I had sort of fallen off the menu planning wagon like bad. I think we were in like a month plus of not doing it at all. And then for really, if I'm being honest, probably the last couple of years, I was only menu planning dinner. And I kind of had us on a system, like Monday was oatmeal, Tuesday was yogurt, Wednesday was waffles, like whatever. So there was kind of this system, but that even started to break down this school year. And I knew with like trying to work from home, my kids ask me 1,000 times a day. And they, my youngest has like a little bit of average picky eating still going on. My middle one has a little bit of like sensory stuff that he's like come so far and worked through so much, but there's still just like a couple of little things there. And they will ask me 1,000 times, what's for lunch? What's for breakfast? What's for dinner? And it's difficult. It becomes a stress for me. So that's one aspect of it. And because of that, because I'm often finishing up somebody's school, like helping somebody finish up their schoolwork now, while 2 other kids are asking me like, what's for lunch? What's for lunch? Or I'm trying to like finish up some work, like that was like my designated work time, and they're entertaining themselves, then I am just opening up it's just like, what can I grab right now? Because you just need to feed them because you don't have the plan. And then that means that you're not even giving them as much variety. When we just take a minute to think, we can use like really smart planning to just get other foods in front of them that they're more likely to eat, but we just don't ever give ourselves a chance because we haven't thought it out. We just haven't taken a minute to think it out.
It's so true. You just go to the regular go-to foods. Katie said, my 13-year-old is more typically picky and definitely benefit from tip number 1. He helped me make the meal plan and was much calmer even when it was a meal he didn't like. So that's awesome. I love to hear that.
Yes.
Like these are very like simplistic tips, but they are like, they're so effective, and they're like just to get that ball rolling. Like there's things that I just don't even think of. Sometimes I go through periods where I've given up with my picky eaters, and then I talk to you and I'm like, there's simple things that I haven't done, like even just previewing, writing on a whiteboard. So we have a question, and we'll just kind of do them intermittently. What is the go-to response when they refuse and you get pushback?
I love that. Great question. And there's a couple of ways we can handle this. I'm going to go back to Katie's comment too. And she brought her son into that process. So he was helping, like he knew what was coming. So he was completely part of that process. You are going to get, if you have a child that's old enough, like really, I mean, you can get creative and even do this with a 3-year-old. But really, the older your child is, the more involved they can be with this. And if you get into a system, especially I think once a week tends to be a good goal that can be manageable once you get yourself into a habit of doing it, whenever that is for you. For me, that's usually a couple of quiet minutes on a Sunday afternoon. And we also, when we menu plan, just kind of as another like menu planning tip, we open up our pantry, we look in our freezer, like what else is in there that's like in the back that like we haven't made in a while, or we need to just like eat and use as a family. Like it just helps us be better at consuming like what we have, especially during these times. So your child can be part of that process. And when you make them part of that process, they are so much less likely to give you any negativity back or any kind of refusal, because they know and they understand it. And you can kind of talk with them as you're doing this planning to say, we need to, like, you can set up some boundaries around it. Like, we need to have a fruit or a vegetable at every meal. So you can help them pick it out. Or we need to have a different vegetable at dinner every night, or we can only use the same vegetable 2 nights. So like if your child only like has one vegetable or one fruit, you don't want to, the solution is not to then just plan the apple slices at every single meal. If you're doing that, it's okay, because if that's like a preferred food that you're serving with them. But like as you're kind of like thinking about planning for the whole family, that's one way. The second way is that you are going to remind them that there is a food there that they normally eat. So it's really, really important that you're making that part of your planning, even if it seems silly. If you are listening right now and you have a child that's only eating a handful of foods that include goldfish and Oreo cookies and French fries, and they're all kind of what you would consider junk foods or foods that you might not normally serve at a dinner for everybody, it's okay to do that if that's all that they're eating. This is like Natasha said, this is like to get the ball rolling. And if you have been doing some stuff and your child has improved, it's a way to just like pick up that momentum again. So it's really just following through. Now you might need to have a talk with them outside of mealtime, again, almost in a way to just preview the preview so that you're saying, hey, I think this is just going to be helpful. And I think even right now with a child that's a little bit older, you can say, we're all at home. And I just think it would be really helpful for us to just have everything out on a menu. I'm always going to make sure that there's something there that you can eat. I'm never going to force you to eat anything that's there. So you want to reiterate that. A lot of our kids' pushback comes from this fear that we're either going to make them eat it or that the foods are going to touch and contaminate. So you also want to think through a plan with them. If you know that that's a fear of theirs, to use like a divided plate or even a small side plate so that they're not totally losing their mind. So again, have that conversation in advance and then, just get them to the table. Over time, like it might take a couple of days or a week, they will fall into this new routine with the consistency that you set up.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is key, that the goal is not to necessarily get them to eat those foods
Yes.
right away. And it's very much like what I talk about with anxiety and OCD and doing exposures. We're incrementally getting our kids exposed and adapted to what they're scared of. And so it's the same thing with food. And the approach that I think you take is like, we're just exposing them. We're
Yes.
just having them around that with my kids, like just having a pot of something that they normally wouldn't eat on the table. That's a good exposure for them. Or having it in a bowl next to their plate initially is a good exposure for them. And so it's just, sometimes we give in before we even try. Totally guilty of this, where I'm just like, I'm just done with it. Here's your chicken nuggets. Here's your goldfish. Here's, like whatever. But it's just, how often do we do those baby steps, previewing their food, setting up some exposures to get them used to it? I think a lot of times when we think of problems, we think of the problem and then the all or nothing solution.
Yeah.
They won't eat. Now they need to eat. There's so much that you talk about, Alisha, that's all in the middle. That's the middle stuff that is so important that a lot of us miss.
Yes, 100%. I'm so glad you said that because that's really the key, because I think so many parents feel defeated about picky eating because we consider it a failure when they haven't eaten. But we really need to build a bridge for them to get there, because if our kids aren't even like, if they're upset that it's even on their plate, they're a lot of steps away before they're willing to like not only take and eat that food, but to like enjoy it and to want to eat it again. Like that, we need to help them get to that point. Like it's way too big of a jump most of the time, especially when we consider that a lot of our picky eaters are picky eaters for a reason. Like there's underlying causes and factors that are causing this. Even though it can seem this way, they're not doing it just to like be bad or to get attention or to be a thorn in our side. Like there's real reasons that they're being selective about the food.
Yeah, I agree. And there's something else I was going to say. One thing that I learned from you when I took actually your course was like, I was way too involved in my kids eating, even with my son. And we're not talking about OCD related eating issues that he has. But even with that, I learned from you that I was like way too involved, where he would report to me, Mom, I ate this, or Mom, I ate this much of this, or Mom, I'm going to eat this. And I realized like, I'm the food police. Like he's reporting to me like to get my approval. And so I've backed off, and I'm kind of like, we'll do exposures where food needs to be near him, or we'll do exposures related to his OCD. But now it's not about me. I'll be like, well, whatever you want to do, or do you want to do that? That's up to you. So I think sometimes also like recognizing it's our kids' journey and that we're here to support them. And it's not a failure. I think a lot of times we think that I love that you said that. It feels like a failure. If we can't provide sustenance to our kids, what kind of mom or dad does that say that we are. It's so hard not to personalize it and not to feel guilty or pressured. And yet, ultimately, there's only so many things our kids can control. Eating, pooping. I think that's pretty much
Sleeping.
it. Sleeping.
Yeah.
All the main daily life skills that are affected by anxiety. So we have to recognize that we don't have that control, but we can kind of coach them. We got a couple of questions, if you don't mind, before we go
ahead.
Okay. Do you make them sit at the table, like strapped in a booster seat? My son doesn't want to sit at the table because he can't stand to see the other food.
Yeah, so good question. I do everything I can to make them sitting at the table work, but it doesn't always work. So and that's something, again, that you can work towards. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing sort of thing. So when a child is really upset by the other food to the table, I am trying to think of a creative solution. Is there, can they sit at the other end of the table and still be with everybody? Can they stand? Can they sit now? It sounds like he's a little bit younger, but for like an older child, sometimes because of sensory needs, they have such a hard time sitting still. And then that's the problem. They just they can't keep their bodies still. And we want good manners. I want them to sit down. And believe me, I'm guilty of this. And I'm like the sensory queen, and I'm guilty of this. So because it bothers my sensory issues when there's just like all this like at the table. So but sometimes we need to let our kids just stand or sit on like a big yoga ball at the table if they can handle that. Now that, like, again, will take a little bit of work so that they're using it appropriately at the table. Probably not for a 2 or 3-year-old on a yoga ball. But it might mean not using the booster seat if it helps them sit still a little bit longer, or finding them a seat at the end and slowly working up to their tolerance of being able to sit. Also, even for a 2 or 3-year-old, if they're really upset by like the smell or the sight of foods, which is really common for extreme picky eaters, work with them. If you're serving foods family style, let everybody serve their food and then remove it so that it's not like all right there. Or think about strategically having some things placed on the table, like put a vase of flowers on the table that's kind of blocking a lot of the other food. Again, if you're able to like kind of position them a little bit down, make sure they're sitting next to you or another adult that can be like a little bit more respectful, understand like what their difficulties are, and kind of like keep their plate a little bit away, or not a sibling that's going to turn and like blow raspberries in their face or something unexpectedly. So kind of think that through. And even outside of a meal, even with a young child, if they're verbal, I would ask them what they think would help them, but that it's a rule to come to the table. It's a goal that you're working on to come to the table. So it's trying out solutions. And also typical toddler behavior can sometimes just be, I don't want to sit there. So if you're listening to this, there's a lot of toddlers that just don't want to be strapped in. They want to, their mind's already going on to the next thing. That's a little bit of a different situation. And I would really be working on getting them to sit in the booster seat and just slowly increasing the amount of time.
Yep. And Schnick had said that she loved that when you were talking about some ideas. We have a lot of questions, but I want to make sure that we get to your second and third point. So I think what I'll do is I'll let you finish up the second and third, and then at the end we'll go and we'll do some of these questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. I love it, guys. Keep them coming. So we've actually already touched on the second tip, which is get food onto their plate. So a lot of times we're just not doing that because, as I think, Karen's actually saying in the comments, like there's just like a yuck or an ooh gross when I put that on there. So we can sometimes ignore those comments. Sometimes we could say, hey, it's not touching anything else. Also, we can put just a very small amount on, or as we were just talking about, take it a step further back. Like where this is going to look different for every child. They might handle just a divided plate in a different compartment. Great. Another child might need a small bowl right next to their plate. Another child might need to just be able to tolerate it on the table at first. So the goal is just to make a choice that you're working towards getting it onto their plate. So think about where your child is and start taking whatever that next step is to helping them get comfortable. Because like I said, if it's not on their plate, I mean, there's just slim to none that they're going to reach across the table and be like, hey, mom, I want to try that broccoli tonight. But if it's on their plate and they're interacting with it in some way, even just it being there is a level of interaction because they've had to probably glance at it. They might have smelled a little bit of it. And we can start working on just increasing that interaction at that level so that they can get comfortable, can understand the food and feel comfortable enough trying it. Okay, so that brings us to number 3, which is cooking together. Now, cooking together is an excellent way to also work at this kind of desensitization of helping them understand what the foods are. I think a lot of parents feel defeated by this suggestion because it's a really popular picky eating tip. Because you'll hear people say all the time who have very average picky eaters, they'll say, oh, my son or daughter made this blah, blah, blah. And because they made it, they ate it. That definitely happens. And your child might surprise you. But I don't want you guys to go into it with that expectation. Instead, when you cook with your child, think of it as a time of interaction with your child, just relationship building. And also think of it as just an opportunity to expose them to the foods. Because when a child cooks with the food, they're touching it, they're smelling it, they might even lick it and bring it to their mouth. It's helping them understand the food. If they end up eating it as a result, that's like icing on the cake. Okay, so cooking together is really powerful too. And it also helps bring that anxiety down because it's, again, another way to preview the food. Like you, even if your child doesn't want to eat the meatloaf or the pork chops or the green beans, and I'm so sorry, guys, that is my house phone. They know I'm on a call, so hopefully someone's gonna grab it lightning fast. So even if they're not eating those things, they are probably not going to flip out that it's on the table or on their plate because they've had an experience with it. They know what's in it. And again, in whatever way that you've kind of negotiated with them, whatever way that you've worked out together, as you said earlier, Natasha, really like trying to think like, how can I support them and be on their team about this instead of making it a, did they eat it or did they not eat it kind of situation.
Yeah. And I mean, I have tried this tip, and with my youngest, my 8-year-old, it definitely works. She wants to be a chef, and so she takes a lot of pride in her cooking. And because she's my classic picky eater, she will much more likely eat whatever we make and force everybody else to try to take a bite than my other kids. But I think even when you have a child who has severe eating issues and isn't going to eat it, it's a great exposure. I mean, I've used that as an exposure for my son with OCD, where, and he doesn't have to cook. I might just say, can you keep me company? And can you like stir the pot? Or can you like chop stuff up? So I'll say, can you just chop this up? And
or wash. Even a 2-year-old can wash off the vegetables. Yeah.
Yep. So it doesn't, I mean, I'm totally neurotic. So with my oldest, who had major eating issues, and like had feeding therapists and everything, I could not cook with her because she was such a messy person. She still is. She's 16 and she's so messy that I have a hard time cooking with her even to this day. But it doesn't have to be cooking. It could be like, hey, stir this. And so for me with her, I could get her to stir something and not feel overwhelmed. Versus like my other kids who aren't as messy. I can handle them, and I've gotten better. But I just want to put that out there that there is like a spectrum of cooking, because I think some of us here cooking with our kids and we're like, oh my gosh, that sounds like a nightmare if you're like me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And yes, it can be such a simple thing. And a lot of times when we do that, sometimes it's great to plan it. If you have a kid that's really open to say, hey, I need your help with dinner later, or, will you help me with this? Just doing small tasks. Like if you're, depending on what type, we all kind of cook different in our own home, but if you're somebody that does make more involved recipes, or it might be overwhelming for them to hold their attention that long or from a sensory standpoint. So yeah, it can just start off really small. And it also sometimes works to just catch kids on the fly. Like you said, just like, hey, can you stir this for me for a couple of minutes? Or when they're walking by, hey, I need that bag of broccoli out. Can you grab that for me and pour it into the strainer? Like those types of little things can also just be really helpful and are just a positive interaction with food.
Yeah, a positive interaction. I like that. And Katie said the cooking idea also works in the garden. The only new foods my son with ARFID has tried the past years has been in the garden or explored edible weeds in the garden, in the yard. That's a really good point. I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to spend some time. We have a lot of time, so answering just questions and answers. But before then, I want to jump into, you're doing a video workshop, which I'm very excited about, a free video workshop, because this is just really the tip of the iceberg of what you have to offer and share. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm so excited to be here today, guys, because today actually starts the free signups. And this is really like a training series for parents of picky eaters, especially extreme picky eaters. So in this workshop series, I'm going to be sharing printables, but there will also be 3 live videos, replays available as well, where I'm going to be walking you through what the common pitfalls are that parents often make that kind of can make picky eating a lot worse. But then we're going to talk a lot about my 2-step process I use. And the 2-step process, but there's like multiple phases in the 2-step. So you're going to learn exactly what I use inside of my program, Mealtime Works, what I've used with my own son, who was an extreme picky eater. And that really involves kind of honing in, drilling down on what the underlying causes are to your child's picky eating, addressing those, and then having a clear plan moving forward. Because I really believe, as we were just talking about, I know because I've worked with thousands of students now online and hundreds in person in my practice, is that it is not like just the tip or the trick. Like these things can really, like you said, kind of build our momentum and help us going, but it's not filling in all of the steps to really make that can make that real life change for them that will last them throughout their life. So I'm super excited about it, especially right now where I think most of us are home with this picky eating problem just kind of around the clock.
Yeah, we are. And I think we're noticing picky eaters more because I always used to be like, well, maybe they ate a big lunch at school.
Yeah.
I'm sure they ate a lot at school. And now I can't do that because I'm seeing them and I'm seeing exactly what they're eating. It's definitely bringing that awareness, I think, to a lot of us, that picky eating is a bigger issue than maybe we thought. So
Yeah.
I do have a link above in pretty much anywhere where this is streaming or in YouTube, the comments and the threads, to register for this video workshop. It's going to be really good. I always like catching your stuff. I think I always get some takeaways from it. So definitely register, and there's links wherever you're watching this.
Yeah, definitely grab a seat because it won't be around forever, guys. So it's definitely a limited time thing. It's a special thing we're doing right now. And like I said, the videos will be live, but you sign up, even if you can't make it live, we'll make sure you get all the replays and all the printables and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and your printables are really, really helpful too. So I want to go back and see if we can go back and answer some of these questions if you have some time.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Mulder had some questions. Mulder said, my son is 14 and he's been refusing meat since toddlerhood. We used to try to reintroduce it, but it always ended badly and we honestly gave up. What are tips for overcoming a texture issue like this?
Oh, very
one.
good one. So yeah, a lot of picky eaters. There's 2 things that most picky eaters have a problem with: meat and vegetables.
Yep.
And the issue with meat in particular is usually the texture. The problem with meat is it's often it's harder to chew and it's a lot of texture. It's actually something I can relate to. It's really interesting. I was never a picky eater personally, but growing up, I could not stand chicken, which is like kind of like a weird thing. And I just have all these memories of my mom making chicken. And I was of the generation, as many of you are, that you don't leave the table until the food is gone, which is a whole nother thing. We're actually going to talk about that in the video series and why that's so detrimental. So stay tuned if you want to hear the answer to that. But I can remember putting this chicken in my mouth, and like the texture seemed so dry to me and difficult to chew. And I remember really wanting to gag. And I was really a kid that didn't really have, we all have different sensory needs, but mine were pretty average. And it was so difficult and so uncomfortable for me. And I can remember doing the thing where you're like sliding it into your napkin. So yeah, oh yeah, like, so it's really truly though, it's one of the things I really can relate to. And meat is very difficult for a lot of our kids because of just that it's a lot of texture in the mouth. It can take forever to chew. It can seem really dry. And then, our solution might be, well, like, let's put some sauce on it, right? Because sauce is great, but that adds this whole other texture component for our picky eaters. Or for instance, I loved chicken legs as a kid. And my mom, I mean, this was the 80s, guys. My mom would put like mayonnaise all over them and like bake them in the oven. And I don't know, I was 5. I thought it was great. But they were juicy and they were really moist. And I loved that kind of chicken and I would eat it. But a picky eater isn't going to do that, because if you pick up a chicken leg, there's so much texture going on. There's so much mess all over your hand. So even though something like chicken leg is way more flavorful, it's just so difficult for them to get past all of the other, and then talk about biting into a chicken leg, and then you might get a bite of something weird, like, like you might get a little bit of a tendon or something, and like that's just going to send them right over the edge. So meat is difficult. So what I like to do for meat, I think that kids can learn to eat meat, and I like to keep meat really thin and crunchy if I can help it. Most picky eaters, not all, I know some of you are probably listening thinking, my kid doesn't like crunchy food. It's certainly not 100% of the time, but if you do have a child that likes those crunchy types of carbs, use that to your advantage. So think about how you can bread meat and how you can make it thin. So one of my favorite things to do is to make homemade chicken nuggets, and I fillet them, I pound them out, I bread them, make them crunchy, and I have gotten a lot of kids eating meat from doing something that simple. Or focus on bacon. Bacon is another good one. Yeah, because bacon is like crunchy. But if you have a child that really likes bland flavors, that might be tricky, because bacon can be like a really bold flavor. So, and also, I lost her name. Was it Karen?
I think so.
Yeah.
Talking about.
Yeah, Karen. Okay, yeah, Karen. Also, you also, did I hit that?
I did.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't, I'm like trying, I'm trying not to.
You're not that powerful.
I maybe did it because I was scrolling. You want to also do the same thing where you're working on that exposure and cooking together, like we talked about, and working towards getting it on his plate. And at his age, I would ask him, I would like talk to him in a really neutral kind of positive way. And that, like, I think this would be a good goal. Like, what do you think we could do as like a first step to try to work towards? Like, what if we look at some pictures of food? And if he can't tolerate that, like some kids that are really extreme picky eaters, it upsets them to even like scroll through Pinterest and see all the different food recipes. Then use some of these suggestions. Do some research on your own and bring to him, so he's not looking at like a ton of images. I found this and the meat's really thin and there's a lot of breading, or whatever it is that he really likes. If he really likes soft foods, then use that angle and look for meat recipes that kind of have that pulled in. But just remember, whenever you're working on any food, you really want to keep it as simple as possible, because the more casserole type foods or saucy foods, all that stuff just adds so many layers, and that will come in time, but you need to start really simple.
I think that's such a great tip, thin and crunchy. I could see where that would be really good. And now that you're saying that, that makes sense, because my kids will not eat beef. They have a big issue with beef. But when I would get like the really thin strips from the store, hard to find now, but really you could probably make them yourself. And then I would like, saute them in like teriyaki and pineapple, and I'd do like strips, almost like they were bacon, but they were beef. They were like super easy to eat. Even my son would eat them, which is shocking. So yeah, that's a great tip. I'm going to go to Karen. I know I've been showing her comment a couple times, but we didn't really get to it. I can put different foods on their plate, but I get a yuck or a ew, gross. One time I used my spaghetti recipe and only changed out the shape of the noodle. Same ground beef, just a different noodle, using the elbow macaroni instead, but nope, they wouldn't eat it.
Yeah. So Karen, I know that can seem really frustrating. And what we call that in like the feeding therapy biz is a food jag. When kids are super specific about the brand, the flavor, and so like it's more of an average picky eating trait when you have a child that's like, my child just loves spaghetti. They usually will eat spaghetti in a ton of different ways. But more of an extreme picky eater, it has to be a specific sauce, specific noodle. It has to be prepared the same way. Again, that's where this like a little bit of anxiety piece comes in. They're very desperately trying to control that this is going to be the same way I tasted it the last time so that I don't have a negative experience. That's what's happening. So in this case, you have a couple of different options. I would, number one, keep working on it. But the next time I would make 2 kinds of noodles and I would serve their regular noodles and the new noodle with it together. So, and maybe you're even freezing a batch of that and like, reusing it a couple times. You're eating the new noodles. You're having them help cook the new noodles. You're letting them know in advance that, hey, we're going to have 2 kinds of noodles for dinner tonight. Those kinds of things can really help make the difference. The second thing though, and this goes with any new food. So when you guys try something and it's like, that didn't work, I want you to take that as data. Yeah, like that's data. That's information that maybe that was too big of a change for them. Like, what could I do that is even a smaller change? And I know when we think, I just changed the noodle, but we can even make it smaller. There's almost always a way to make it smaller. Can you like serve their regular noodles, but cut them up a little bit? So they're just like, or maybe like cut some of them up. Could you do another noodle that's very close in shape and size to the noodle that they normally eat, but not exactly the same? So those are other ways that you could take just smaller steps to help them get comfortable. But I would absolutely pull in those other strategies that we talked about today.
Yeah, I think that's good. And she also mentioned, Karen said, I'm a picky eater. And I think because of that, I didn't expose my kids to enough of a variety of foods. Do you think that has anything to do with my kids being picky? It must. LOL. We're always blaming ourselves.
I know. And you know what? I'm really big on parents not blaming themselves because picky eating is really complex. And there's almost always, like, especially Karen, with a more of an extreme picky eater situation, which it sounds like kind of might be your case because they're really even particular about the shape of noodle. There's some other stuff going on. And here's the other thing, guys. This isn't always the case. Picky eating is genetic. So if you have some underlying issues with like texture and flavors, that gets passed on to our kids. Not always. And sometimes you can have a picky eater and both parents can be foodies. I'm not saying that it's an always situation, but it's common to see a link. So I would not necessarily blame yourself because if you expose them to other foods since then and they still haven't done it, then that's really not your fault.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of times I feel like just parentally in general, we take on the stress of like owning all of our kids' problems. And I always say, especially with anxiety and OCD too, like there's a genetic predisposition for that and probably even for picky eating maybe, but it's not that we're causing these issues. It's just that we can make them better. So it's like, what can we do to help our kids make it better? Yeah. That's our role. Our role isn't to fix the problem because we can't open their little mouths and just shove food in. Right. That would be totally not okay. And
right. Not okay.
Not okay. And we want to empower them. We want to teach them how to be, I like how you always say, like lifelong healthy eaters. Like we want to change their approach to food all the time. So going back to Mulder, she had said that it's funny, there was a brief time in early elementary school when he would eat bacon. So
yeah, so that's a huge clue. Go back to that. Yeah.
Yep. Well, and then Karen's like, picky eating, is it genetic? I really don't know. I don't know what the research is on that. Is there any genetic
Uh,
predisposition?
I don't think that there is, but I will tell you, I see it constantly. So it's my own personal experience, but I really feel that it is because I see it all the time, and it's very similar issues. Like again, there's usually a sensory component to it. So and we do know that sensory processing difficulties can be genetic. So it makes sense that if the sensory processing difficulties are making picky eating hard, like causing picky eating, and the parent has similar sensory processing difficulties, it would make sense that there's a genetic connection. But
Yeah,
again, that's my professional opinion. So
yeah, and I agree. I mean, I feel like with anything, when you have anxiety, you tend to be more sensitive inside and out, and you have more sensory issues, and you're also more cautious. And anxiety has a high genetic predisposition, and so it's going to overlap. And so I can see that. I have an adult picky eater too. When I was posting this
yeah.
about your workshop, somebody had said something like, "What about adults?" And I was like, seriously, I have 3 picky eaters, but really I have 4. And like my biggest one is a big person.
Yeah, right. Well, my husband was a mild picky, like I would say an average picky eater, and same. He's still, I mean, he's great, and I've actually got him to eat a lot of new foods over the years, and he's come such a far. Like I really wouldn't even call him picky eater now, but we started dating. He had this list of foods that he would not eat because of the texture, and I was already in OT school, so I was like, great, but my son had the same exact thing. It was just the texture issue. So many of the same types of foods he didn't want to eat either. I mean, it was just such a clear parallel to me.
Yeah, that's funny. And even if, you hide that, your kids, it could
Oh, right,
genetically
right.
given.
Because we were doing yeah, right. They had no idea. He never made any comments or verbalized that at all.
Yeah. Let me see. I've got one more question. So I do want to mention for any of you that are asking me questions about anxiety and OCD, I know it's nice to get me live, but I'm not going to answer anything that's not related to picky eating right now. So if I'm skipping your comment, it's not because I'm being rude. Just so you know. Megan said, I joined Alicia's course a while ago. It's been very helpful for us as parents to step back and not get so wound up at mealtime. I've also been able to talk to my son when there's something new and ask what he's worried about with the food. So even if he doesn't try it, we talk about the worry behind it. I love that.
Yay, Megan. I love it. Thank you.
I think that's really helpful because I think that that's the black and white thinking of we have a picky eater. Now tell me how to solve picky eating. So either they're eating or they're not eating. I'm either successful or I'm not successful. And just like anxiety and OCD, if you look at it in that plain black and white, you're missing the whole process. You climb
Right.
steps, you climb stairs. You don't just jump to the top unless you're Spider-Man, and none of us are. So,
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I think this has been really helpful to everybody who's joined us live and everyone who will watch it on the replay.
I love it.
Yeah, I want to encourage everyone to dive in deeper and get some more ahas with Alisha in registering for her workshop. The video workshop comes with great handouts and great insight, and learning her 2-step process to get your kids to be healthy eaters for a lifetime. That'll be awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
absolutely. Thank you for having me. So glad to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Yep.